Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the online roundtable discussion on Indigenous peoples, climate change, and the role of decent work for a just and peaceful transition at the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development 2022. I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers of the Stockholm Forum and to our partners, the Indigenous Major Group for Sustainable Development and the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples, the lead discussants whom we'll hear from in a few minutes, and all participants for your interest. I am Manuela Tomei. I'm the director of the Conditions of Work and Equality Department of the ILO in Geneva. I have been asked to moderate this roundtable discussion. Let me explain how I intend to conduct it. I will say a few words at the beginning to frame our conversation today. I will then turn to our four distinguished lead discussants and ask them a few questions to kick the conversation off. I will then invite interventions from the audience, and please place your comments and questions in the chat box for an interactive discussion with our lead discussants. After that, I will conclude the roundtable. So let me now say a few words about what is bringing us today here. Indigenous people's rights and concerns have become central to global and local debates on development, human rights, climate change, and peace. And Indigenous peoples themselves have been at the forefront in making connections across these interrelated agendas. Today's roundtable is an opportunity to discuss specific actions for greater synergies and coherence across these different and important agendas. There are more than 480 million Indigenous peoples across the world. They continue to face entrenched discrimination and exclusion that jeopardize their livelihoods, well-being, and their very existence sometimes. While an increasing number of countries recognize Indigenous peoples' cultures and identities, what is often lacking is a common vision for sustainable, fair, and inclusive future for all. Visions on development of Indigenous peoples and the state are often seen as clashing and entailing trade-offs. In such a context, the potential for conflict is high and bound to increase. The impacts of climate change are serious and wide-ranging for all, but they constitute a major threat to Indigenous peoples' livelihoods, ways of life, and existence, given their close relationship with nature. They live in areas most affected by climate change, and further, some climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, such as sustainable energy projects or mining projects to extract metal for car batteries, may have or can have negative impacts on the lands and livelihoods of Indigenous communities, while there is very hardly any support for their own adaptation and mitigation strategies. These challenges are even more serious in fragile and conflict-affected areas, where exposure to violence, particularly of Indigenous women, is commonplace. Taken together, all these risks can perpetuate instability, exacerbate the causes of conflicts, and undermine the resilience of Indigenous communities. In countries such as Colombia, Guatemala, and Nepal, peace agreements included commitments to the protection of Indigenous people rights and the ratification of ILO Convention 169 on Indigenous and tribal peoples. They were regarded as essential to addressing historic injustices and inequalities and to building inclusive, multi-ethnic, and peaceful societies. Yet, implementation remains an enormous challenge everywhere. The absence of safe spaces for genuine dialogue, consultation, and participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making on a range of issues, including access to employment and decent work opportunities, social protection, or healthcare is part of the problem. Land-related tensions and conflicts remain frequent, and access to remedies is simply non-existent. All of this increases Indigenous peoples' vulnerability to climate change and undermines their ability to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Yet, Indigenous peoples are crucial agents of change and essential partners to sustaining peace and inclusive development while adapting to climate change and mitigating its impacts. ILO Convention 169 and Recommendation 205 on employment and decent work for peace and resilience provide useful frameworks. They acknowledge the specific risks and challenges facing Indigenous women and men, and that their consultation and direct participation in decision-making process is vital for them and for society at large. To this end, institutions, laws, and policies must be put in place to promote policy coherence in partnership with Indigenous peoples. The goal of today's discussion is to generate practical ideas on how to address these huge and conflating challenges. And there are three questions that we would like to get some elements of an answer by the end of today's roundtable. First, what should be the main ingredients of a common vision for sustainable, fair, and inclusive future for all, including Indigenous peoples? Second, where do we want to be 20 years down the road? And third, how can we build bridges across concerned actors, including Indigenous peoples, and policies to make that vision a reality? Giving thought to these issues is urgent, not only because of the intensifying effects of climate change, but also because of other major ongoing crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and armed conflicts and war in various parts of the world, including more recently in Ukraine. Let me now introduce the lead discussants, and in the interest of time, I will be very brief, but you can have access to their full CVs on the events page. May I also remind the audience to submit questions and comments throughout the session using the Let me start again with welcoming our distinguished guests of today. Mr. Oscar Perez Ramirez, who is the Vice Minister of Sustainable Development of the Ministry of Energy and Mining of Guatemala. Ms. Lucy Mulenkay, who is the Vice President of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, of which she is a co-founder, from the Maasai community, and a lifelong advocate for Indigenous peoples' concerns and rights. Mr. Ivan Zambrana Flores, Minister Counselor of the Permanent Mission of Bolivia to the United Nations in New York, an expert on Indigenous traditional knowledge, and also a former climate negotiator for his country. And last but not least, Ms. Joanne Carling, Executive Director of the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous Peoples. Of course, she's very well known to all of us. She doesn't need introduction. She's a key figure in the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development. I will ask two questions to each of our lead discussants before opening to interventions from the floor, and I invite our lead discussants to be as concise as possible in their answers in order to give time for interventions from the floor. So I will start with Mr. Oscar Perez Ramirez. Mr. Perez, within the Ministry of Energy and Mining of Guatemala, you are responsible for consultations with and participation of Indigenous peoples. Building mechanisms and frameworks for consultations and participation has been a challenge everywhere in the world. Could you tell us about your government's strategy and results, as well as the obstacles that you have been facing and how have you tried to overcome them. Over, Mr. Ramirez.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tomei, and dear participants. I will answer in my native language. Primero sobre los mecanismos y marcos que se han construido en Guatemala. Básicamente, voy a retomar las palabras que usted mencionó al inicio, que los pueblos indígenas son clave para el desarrollo sostenible en el mundo. En Guatemala, que es un país donde el 48% de la población pertenece a alguno de los pueblos indígenas que existen acá, esta afirmación se vuelve más que retórica, se vuelve crítica. Básicamente nosotros hemos encontrado, voy a hablar primero de los obstáculos, hemos encontrado mucha desconfianza desde los pueblos indígenas hacia los sectores no indígenas y particularmente hacia el gobierno. Esa desconfianza pues se debe a razones históricas que se repiten en otros países donde hay alta población indígena y donde los pueblos indígenas figuran con indicadores de desarrollo mucho más bajos que el resto de la población. Esa desconfianza también genera otro tipo de obstáculos que ha sido la polarización, que por otros actores con intereses ideológicos y políticos se oponen en algunos casos a que este diálogo exista entre el gobierno y los pueblos indígenas de manera directa. Lo que nosotros hemos hecho ha sido un acercamiento frontal desde de las autoridades del ministerio, en este caso de Energía y Minas o del gobierno. Algo que hemos encontrado que ha sido diferente a las aproximaciones que han tenido administraciones anteriores es que ha sido el mismo ministro quien ha participado en las reuniones con los líderes indígenas, los viceministros de otros ministerios, incluyéndome a mí mismo también, hemos estado y hemos dirigido estas acciones de relacionamiento con los pueblos indígenas y eso ha generado una diferencia. Algo que nos ha servido muchísimo ha sido ante las diferentes interpretaciones que puede existir sobre cómo se debe aplicar el derecho de consulta establecido en el convenio 169, nosotros hemos recibido muchísimo apoyo de parte de organizaciones internacionales, incluyendo a la misma Organización Internacional del Trabajo, al Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo, a la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos y la Cooperación Alemana, en jornadas de formación y entrenamiento para el equipo que actualmente desarrolla las consultas. Pero sobre todo yo quisiera resaltar el rol de la Organización Internacional del Trabajo, que no solamente ha colaborado con entrenamiento, sino que también con soporte. De hecho, actualmente, pues, nos encontramos en una fase de apoyo en la que la unidad del Ministerio de Energía y Minas que se encargaría de hacer las consultas en adelante, pues está siendo conformada de acuerdo a experiencias de otros países que son proporcionadas por la misma OIT. Como resultado, pues hemos tenido avances significativos en el relacionamiento con líderes indígenas, hemos completado ya consultas comunitarias, consultas a pueblos indígenas, consultas que no dejan de ser en algunos casos cuestionadas, pero afortunadamente y gracias al apoyo y al soporte que hemos tenido de estas instituciones que les menciono, pues hemos logrado tener avances significativos. Básicamente por ahí me quedaría en esta pregunta.
Muchas gracias y efectivamente también el hecho de subrayar cómo el involucramiento de parte del propio ministro y viceministros de otras agencias han contribuido a generar o a reducir quizás un poco la falta de confianza, la desconfianza que muchas veces existe de parte de los pueblos indígenas, comunidades indígenas hacia el Estado. I have a second question for you. As you yourself have highlighted, Indigenous peoples' issues span the areas of competence of various government institutions. So let's imagine that in 20 years down a road, a whole of government approach on Indigenous peoples' affairs will have been established in Bolivia, ensuring coordinated action by government for the effective participation of Indigenous communities and their access to decent work and sustainable livelihoods. Which steps, in your view, should have been taken to get there? Over.
Muchas gracias. Sí, bueno, es muy interesante que usted mencione de un margen de tiempo a 20 años. La economía en el mundo está sufriendo un proceso de descarbonización a pasos muy grandes. Cada vez tenemos una economía más verde en el mundo y dentro de 20 años seguramente las tecnologías verdes, energías renovables, transporte eléctrico y movilidad sostenible va a ser realidad, pero esa realidad necesita de elementos, posiblemente de algunos elementos químicos que deben ser aprovechados y que existen en este caso en Guatemala. Para Guatemala, el tema de la descarbonización de la economía en el mundo es crítico, porque los recursos minerales del país cada vez, y de aquí a 20 años, eso esperamos que se vuelvan mucho más valiosos que el día de hoy. Eso significa que el país va a pasar en términos generales por un proceso de conversión que debería realizarse de una manera justa y buscando que los empleos que se generan, que la economía dinamizada se dinamice de una manera verde. Para eso, definitivamente, y como ya mencioné, con un 48% de la población que es indígena, el camino se vuelve mucho más relevante en términos de la relación que existe entre el gobierno y los pueblos indígenas. Quizás el primer paso que yo veo es el poder finalizar de manera exitosa los procesos que en esta administración se están desarrollando, los procesos de consulta a pueblos indígenas que se están desarrollando, pero quizás el elemento más importante podría ser la generación de un mecanismo para poder realizar de manera sistemática y coordinada, tal como establece el convenio 169, las consultas a pueblos indígenas, no desde el punto de vista de los proyectos energéticos y mineros únicamente, sino de una manera general y que sea tratado por el gobierno de una manera integral. Aquí tenemos que reconocer que existe también un reto. En algún caso, en algunos momentos, la misma Organización Internacional del Trabajo, por medio de las diferentes herramientas que ha emitido, se ha hecho la afirmación de que el convenio es en sí mismo autoejecutable. Y esa afirmación ha sido utilizada en otros momentos para afirmar que no se debería regular, que no debe existir un mecanismo como un manual o como un reglamento de cómo realizar las consultas a pueblos indígenas. Nosotros creemos firmemente que eso no es así, que para poder realizar un actuar coordinado y sistemático, para poder tomar las buenas prácticas que hemos encontrado hasta el momento y para no cometer los errores que también se han cometido en su momento, se requiere de emitir algún tipo de reglamentación y nosotros le apostamos a que sea por medio de un acuerdo gubernativo emitido por el presidente en Consejo de Ministros, que esto pueda suceder y que debería pasar dentro de esta administración también. Ese quizás sería el primero, los dos primeros pasos que hay que dar, finalizar. Uno sería finalizar los procesos que actualmente se están desarrollando y el segundo sería poder emitir la reglamentación que permita pues un actuar, repito, sistemático y coordinado de acá en adelante para el resto de las administraciones de gobierno que nos sucedan.
Thank you very much for these very concrete responses and tips about the way forward. I will now turn my attention to Ms. Lucy Mulenkei. You are a woman from the Maasai community in Kenya and a lifelong advocate for Indigenous people's rights globally and locally. Could you tell us about the livelihood challenges that Indigenous peoples in Africa and other parts of the world are facing, including those challenges that result from violence and conflict? And what are the specific and additional challenges that Indigenous women and girls experience in that context? Over.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be able to speak and discuss about Indigenous women, decent work, and also other Indigenous peoples, especially looking at the countries and the continents that we come from. One of the things that I should explain is that for Africa, the main indigenous peoples and the local communities, hunter-gatherers who are living in the region, some of them, the main economy is trading, that is livestock is their own economy, so they do quite a number of other different activities of trading livestock and so on. And also the women have picked up that particular kind of activity and work so that they are able to sustain their own families. Simply because some of these communities come from very, very remote areas. And in those remote areas, they are semi-arid, they are dry areas. Some of them, like in the Sahel and other parts of the Kalahari down in the desert in the south, and also in Kenya, where we have almost 80% of our country to be, say, semi-arid and arid lands. And so their main economy and their main activities are mainly, livestock trading, economic activities, and so on. And in these particular lands, there are quite a number of challenges that occur. In fact, when you introduced this particular discussion, you brought quite a number of issues. And some of these issues are the impact on our people and also on the climate change and the lands of our communities. And one of the key areas where brings out conflict is lack of some of those resources which are needed and competition of the same resources, simply because of the prolonged droughts that normally impact these communities in their own region, that they are not able specifically to be able to adopt and mitigate climate change. And it impacts in most of their lives, not only them as peoples, but also the children and everybody and their own economy. And one of the biggest problems that faces the same communities is issues of infrastructure and also some laws, land tenure issues that impact on them. And we find that even though these particular problems just impact on these communities, they still struggle. But when conflict occurs, the most important people that are impacted on are women and children, because when they are displaced, when they have to move from those areas, they are also impacted with that, and they face violence, they face displacement, and this impacts on their life, on their tradition, on their economy. There is also big lack of water, lack of basic needs that are very, very important for them to be able to manage their own kind of life. And it is always normal and very difficult to handle these, especially issues of water, because water and pasture is one of the key issues that brings a lot of conflict within the indigenous peoples in Africa, especially those pastoralists that I've mentioned. So it's very important to try and look at those economies and look at the issues that really impact on them and be able to see how can we look at those and look at issues of infrastructure. How can we look at land issues? And how can we look at these policies? We build the capacity of the indigenous women so that they can be an indigenous people, so that they can be able to manage some of their own economies and to understand the laws and to be able to contribute. But one important thing that I want to bring out that can only be able to solve most of our problems is to make sure that we have a human rights approach, and to be able to include the same communities to be able to contribute themselves, to see what are the activities that they can be able to undertake so that they have a decent life and they can live peacefully without fear, without even worrying, and without being violated, their rights being violated as women and as girls. So these are very, very important issues that I may want to carry on in the discussion as we move on to the next question of the day today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for bringing up these very important issues, including indeed the need for indigenous communities, and in particular women to participating in creating and devising sustainable solutions to all the problems relating to climate change and enhanced competition on land and water, besides the question of also of how to address land tenure issues in a way that might be more conducive to sustainable and peaceful relations. So again, I have another sort of futuristic question. 20 years down the road, what would be the ideal world of work for indigenous communities in your country look like, and what will have been the steps taken to get there?
I think the most important thing, the steps that should have been taken like 20 years ago. First of all, the African countries should realize and really, sign the ILO 169, because so far in Africa, it's not like in the other countries. They have not signed and recognized the ILO 169, even though these have been presented to them, but they still have a lot of work to do. And the recognition of the rights of those communities, no matter how far they are and their traditional way of life, is very, very important. The communities, and especially women, have already started their own activities to try and adapt and mitigate climate change, but they need to have a lot of support. The activities that they are undertaking to make like restoration, ecosystem restoration, trying to make other alternative livelihoods that they have, are important to be supported. And if we have to have and really go ahead in terms of looking at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we must make sure that we support these indigenous peoples and indigenous women who are living in the very remote areas and who are also doing a lot of work to try and sustain their own livelihoods. This is very, very important to them. And looking at what the first presenter from Guatemala was talking about, the green economy and looking at different issues, the indigenous people are ready to do that because they're already doing a lot in terms of looking at their different work in using their own traditional way of life and having that economy sustaining them up to where they are. Let's also remember that the population is also growing, the different activities, there is need for a lot of things to be done. But if we can support indigenous people, make sure that at least also the funding, when it comes, it goes to them so that their capacity is enhanced, they can be able to improve and increase the activities that they have in their own economic activities that they have and in their own lives. That will be something that can make a lot of change. But even if we go for 20 years and do all this work, we should not stop continuing to make sure that we recognize their rights, we support them, and we make sure that whatever they do, they are also included in different policy formulation so that they can bring their issues on the table, because that's the only way that we can be able to make a difference. We can't make difference by just discussing, but we need to make sure that they are the ones to decide and to bring recommendations to the table so that this can be undertaken and it can be them that can be implemented, because we know that different countries do have different laws. They have put so many there, but still implementation is the biggest problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these contributions. And indeed, well, I mean, the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples is absolutely essential. And Convention 169, the ratification of 169, would be one way of signaling that commitment to the respect of indigenous peoples' rights. And the other thing, very important, things you said about the fact that indigenous communities, and in particular women, are indeed already putting in place strategies in order to adapt and mitigate the impact of climate change, but they need support. Yeah. And support is reflected not only in providing financial means or technical support, but being able to sit at the table and indeed contributing to the design of such interventions. Thank you very much for those important comments. So I will now move to Mr. Ivan Zambrano Flores. You have been involved in climate negotiations on behalf of your country, Bolivia. Can you explain why and how indigenous people's ways of life and livelihoods and knowledge, I would add, can contribute to climate action, including through a just transition, resilience, and peace? Over.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me thank all the organizers for inviting me to this highly relevant roundtable. Indigenous worldviews, ways of life, and collective action contribute to climate change action in many transformative ways. Certainly, there has been they have had a key role in tackling the climate crisis and the structural causes it has. But of course, it would be unfair to impose mitigation commitments on them. And certainly we have to prioritize adaptation of their communities when we incorporate indigenous issues in across different agendas, including energy. On the other hand, we also must acknowledge that they have already influenced climate policy and practice directly through their organizations and institutions and through their effective participation in shaping state policies and actions, particularly in countries such as Bolivia, since we have an indigenous majority. And I would like to give you some examples of this critical input at different scales. In my country, traditional knowledge is not something to be respected only. It is something that has become a basis of governance. The principles of indigenous wisdoms are at the center of the constitution we adopted in 2009, and for the first time in a democratic fashion. Those core ideas continue to drive our position as a country in international negotiations, especially regarding issues related to indigenous peoples, harmony with the rest of nature, and climate change. Consequently, indigenous peoples have influenced the Paris Agreement by mandating the Bolivian government to incorporate novel approaches in the text and in different parts of the whole arrangement. For instance, Bolivia spearheaded the inclusion of the concept of Mother Earth in the preamble and redistributive and restorative understanding of climate justice. But also in practical terms, in the operational part of the agreement, we strive for the inclusion of non-market approaches because we were demanded by indigenous peoples to do so, because they were concerned about the commoditization of climate action. Well, but maybe the most important contribution has been the creation of what is called the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities Platform, which was established under UNFCCC in COP21, and it was fully operationalized in COP24. This body is unique in the multilateral system because it includes both parties and indigenous peoples representatives on equal footing. That means that we have, for the first time, a place in which we can enhance knowledge exchange, build capacity, and channel indigenous peoples' proposals for climate action in a formal way, not only through their demands or their plight. Well, these are some of the tangible contributions of indigenous peoples, and we hope that these their contribution will be even more catalytic in the future.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Yeah, I think you actually provided a couple of examples of how indigenous peoples have indeed been already contributing to the shaping of policies to counter climate change, and thanks to their insights and contributions, the Paris Agreement indeed has incorporated some novel approaches, as you were referring to, and more specifically non-market approaches to climate action. So, I mean, I think this is quite interesting. So I have another futuristic question to you as well, which is that, again, let's imagine that in 20 years from now, a critical number of indigenous communities will have achieved land tenure security, leveraged their knowledge for sustainable and resilient livelihoods, and built local low-carbon economies. So which interventions, in your opinion, would have been taken to attain such results? Over to you.
Thank you. On the outset, I believe that maybe it's a little bit awkward to frame the relationship between indigenous peoples and their land in terms of assets or in terms of leverage, which sometimes brings or takes us to a traditional way of understanding economics, for example. And I do believe that the diverse indigenous understandings of value don't fit the model of green economy necessarily, but at the same time, I believe that there is a lot they will be able to contribute in the future. Obviously, in 20 years, we hope that all indigenous rights are going to be already fulfilled, and that both collective and individual rights are ensured by the states, but also states provide the capabilities to, or provide the means of enjoying and fulfilling those rights, which we believe it's something that is crucial for this future that we have to envision. At the same time, this future has to be able to consider that we are not going to arrive there on equal footing, because we cannot demand everybody, for example, to decarbonize at the same time. We developing countries have been communicating our need to have more space to do so because of our historical responsibilities and the right to development we have as countries. But at the same time, indigenous peoples are even in an even more they have even a larger need for that space. We cannot believe that the decarbonization has to be imposed on the shoulders of indigenous peoples. Actually, it's the other way around. We have to ensure that their resilience and their adaptive capacity is put at the forefront of the priorities of developed and developing countries. And what we also should be doing is to try to learn from them to reshape this new future. And that new future has to be reshaped by including, for example, how they understand the value of nature, how they understand what it's called the productive and reproductive labor of nature, in terms of how we take care of Mother Earth and how Mother Earth take care of us, not just in a philosophical way, but in terms of actual economic flows. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge that from this perspective, we have to think differently about what is a just transition for them, what is decent jobs or decent work for indigenous peoples, and how we have to, instead of making them fit a new development model, how our development model has to change in order to incorporate what they have been doing right all this time, and incorporate not just their specific needs, but to bring them to the discussion in order to reshape the system that is going to work for all of us in terms of while ensuring climate and social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, two very important thoughts. The first is that the cost of decarbonization cannot be imposed on the shoulders of indigenous peoples. And the other one relates to the notion of just transition. What does it mean for indigenous peoples, and to what extent the just transition model that eventually we will be embracing should indeed take into account and build upon the indigenous people's own vision. So thank you for that. I will now move to our fourth and last but not least lead discussant, Joan Carling. John, you, as you know, from the local to the global level, indigenous peoples claim their rights and highlight and show how they contribute to protecting the planet. Yet, even where indigenous peoples are formally recognized, frameworks and mechanisms for dialogue, for consultation, for participation are often lacking, or if they exist, they are inadequate. In such a context, of course, reaching agreements or obtaining consent remains elusive. So again, 20 years down the road, which steps, in your view, should be taken by the different actors concerned to build national and local systems that build and realize a common vision for sustainable and inclusive development, for peace and the protection of the planet? Over to you.
Thank you. I have three elements for this. First is to build collaboration and partnership with indigenous peoples to combat, based on the rights, of course, of indigenous peoples to combat climate change and advance sustainable development. The second is to ensure meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in decision-making, particularly in relation to how it affects our rights and well-being, as well as also our aspirations. And third is the replication of good practices and values of indigenous peoples. For example, the issue of in living in harmony with nature and maintaining, strengthening solidarity and cooperation. So for the first one, on the collaboration and partnership, this means ensuring security of land, territories, and resources for indigenous people, so we can continue our sustainable food systems, conservation practices, and sustainable resource management systems. And these systems include the practice of traditional occupations, which is, as far as we are concerned, decent work. It should be considered as decent work and even sustainable work for indigenous peoples. And by doing these traditional occupations, it actually enhances sustainable resource management in reciprocal relations between indigenous peoples and nature. It also encompasses the use of traditional knowledge, which is very important in strengthening community resilience and in community mitigation and adaptation to climate change. The second part is on the decision-making, the participation in decision-making, that our views should also be accounted for, and that decisions should not be imposed upon us. This is that we need to operationalize in real terms the very concept of free, prior, and informed consent as a way of ensuring that indigenous peoples are part of decision-making, that we are also allowed to express our views and make our own contributions and be the framework as well of partnerships. And the third that I mentioned is the replication, and this is critical, the replication of good practices of indigenous peoples in terms of maintaining harmonious relations with nature. This is the embodiment of sustainability, which we do not think of the future generation, but I mean the present generation, but also the future generation in the way we manage and use our resources, that we conserve it for the future generation. So these are some of the steps that I hope will become the reality in the next 20 years.
Again, very, very concrete tips about how to move onward. And I like very much what you said about the fact that traditional occupations are constitute decent work, and you have added one important feature of decency at work, which is the sustainability of these works and what they contribute to. I have another question for you, which is the following one. You are involved in the Rights Energy Partnership, which is an initiative of Indigenous peoples to engage with the energy sector. We would be very interested in knowing more about this initiative, what it does in relation to climate action, peace building, and decent work and livelihood opportunities. Over.
Yeah, so the Right Energy Partnership has two main goals. One is to ensure that, that the just transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, which we are of course supporting, should also be anchored and framed, anchored on the respect and protection of Indigenous people's rights. We've seen, for example, solar energy windmills, dams are being developed in our territories without our consent, and destroying our resources, and the power is going outside our communities. We are hosts of these projects, but we're not getting the benefit, and our rights are completely violated. So there is a need to anchor it. It cannot be business as usual in renewable energy. The second is to provide access to energy for Indigenous communities. 70% of Indigenous peoples are in rural areas, and majority do not have access to energy. And yet we host energy projects. So many dams are in our territory. So this is a question also of discrimination and inequality. So the Right Energy Partnership wants to address these issues, and putting Indigenous peoples as the drivers for renewable energy development in our territories. And it should empower women, that women are integral to this effort to accelerate access to energy by Indigenous communities, and that the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples, traditional occupations, food systems are the ones that are enhanced. So it's not just putting bulb in each house, but more importantly, economically empowering Indigenous communities, building our cooperation, building our solidarity, and making sure that those in the margins are being part of this self-determined development process at the community level. So ensuring women, persons with disabilities are part of this effort to force self-determined development. It's also at the center of addressing the other and meeting other SDG goals in terms of reducing poverty, reducing hunger. So it's actually a central issue for the community-based development of Indigenous peoples in a sustainable way. So we've reached out already to different actors. We have already the support of a number of UN agencies in this regard. UNEP, UNDP, IFAD have already given their support to this initiative. A number of foundations, some governments are supporting this. For example, Chile, they have now a very good energy policy that is fully in line with ILO 169, which I think is something that should be replicated. So I think this kind of partnership is really transforming the way we put rights holders at the center of driving solutions to climate change, but also advancing sustainable development.
Thank you very much. Again, the issue of respect and protection of rights of indigenous peoples seems to be really the sort of common thread, the red line across all your interventions of the key discussants. And also the fact that when it comes to renewable energy, it cannot continue to be business as usual. And the paradox that indeed the majority of indigenous peoples around the world live in rural areas where dam projects are, prevalent, and yet they are not benefiting from this country, from energy. So indeed, this injustice in terms of what they contribute to the wider society and what they get in return from so-called development projects. I have a couple of questions here. One is how can the international community further strengthen and protect indigenous people's rights when in situation of conflict with strong financial and corporate interest? I think this is a question which is relevant to all of the lead discussants, and therefore I may actually give the floor again to Mr. Oscar Perez. Yes. Would you like to start? And then we will ask Lucy, Ivan, and Joan. Please go
Claro
ahead.
que sí, muchísimas gracias. Bueno, creo que la mejor manera en que la comunidad internacional podría contribuir en estos casos es, paradójicamente quizás, contribuyendo a un cambio de paradigma. Me explico. Quienes trabajamos en defensa de los derechos de pueblos indígenas, ante estos casos, tenemos una tendencia de pensar que los intereses corporativos se contraponen de entrada a los derechos de pueblos indígenas, y posiblemente el mundo corporativo piensa que las prácticas indígenas son un obstáculo para poder llevar a cabo actividades de desarrollo tal como de manera no indígena o de manera tradicional o occidental, como dicen en algunos casos, se visualiza el desarrollo. Lo que hemos encontrado nosotros, particularmente en Guatemala, es que existe un punto intermedio. Hay una forma en que debe haber una forma y debemos buscarla. Ese es quizás el rol de la comunidad internacional. ¿Cómo podemos buscar una forma en que tanto el mundo corporativo pueda dejar de hacer negocios tal como hasta el momento se han desarrollado, como decía una de las panelistas? Como la otra panelista también explicaba que existen prácticas tradicionales indígenas de muy bajo impacto ambiental. Y sí, en Guatemala también es así, tenemos prácticas agrícolas, tenemos pesca artesanal en algunos casos, que está relacionado o está en áreas donde hay proyectos extractivos. Sin embargo, esas prácticas o quienes desarrollan esas prácticas artesanales, esas prácticas ancestrales, esas prácticas muy ligadas a la forma cultural en la forma en que los pueblos culturalmente han desarrollado sus formas de vida. También los pueblos indígenas tienen intereses en que esas prácticas puedan desarrollarse sin que lleguen a ser prácticas de alto impacto ambiental. Pero sí, tener pequeñas empresas pesqueras, el tener acceso de los pequeños productores a mercados internacionales de productos como cacao o como cardamomo, por ejemplo, en Guatemala, eso es posible. Y hay una forma en que los intereses corporativos, los intereses industriales, puedan contribuir a que estas pequeñas empresas se puedan desarrollar. Vean, lo que hemos encontrado es que uno de los derechos que más claman los pueblos indígenas y muchos que viven en áreas rurales es el derecho al trabajo. Pero existe la percepción equivocada de que las grandes empresas son las que le van a dar trabajo a toda la gente, y eso no es así. Pero mediante una gestión de gobierno adecuada, eso sí es posible, los recursos que provengan de estas grandes empresas pueden ser destinados al desarrollo local de bajo impacto, un desarrollo, una transición verde, una transición de bajo impacto. Esto se puede lograr únicamente si el gobierno tiene un contacto directo, un contacto local con los pobladores. Hay un poema de un poeta guatemalteco, Humberto Cabal, un poeta indígena, que dice, no es que las piedras sean mudas, solamente es que decidieron estar calladas. Y resulta que cuando vamos al territorio a hablar con los pobladores indígenas, sí encontramos que existe una voluntad de poder, o no solamente la voluntad, existe la necesidad que ellos manifiestan para desarrollar aún más sus formas de vida. Para eso se necesitan recursos, recursos que pueden provenir de estas industrias, pero para eso, para poder lograrlo se necesita que el gobierno tenga un enfoque mucho más de presencia y de relación directa con los pueblos indígenas. Y lo mismo debería pasar con la comunidad internacional, que para poder discriminar aquellos casos donde hay una oportunidad en que el desarrollo mundial contribuya también al desarrollo y a la protección de los derechos de pueblos indígenas y que esto pueda diferenciarse de algunos casos que los puede haber, en los que puede existir violaciones a derechos de los pueblos indígenas, debe conocer cada situación en particular. No se puede tomar decisiones totalmente desde un despacho, y tampoco se debería tomar decisiones que afectan al mundo entero solamente desde otros países. Es importante la presencia de la comunidad internacional en los países donde está teniendo colaboración o intervención de algún tipo y que pueda contribuir a que se genere este cambio de paradigma. De verdad, la contradicción, la oposición entre las diferentes partes no lleva a que nadie camine. Tenemos que buscar un mecanismo de diálogo intermedio en el que se busque una forma de poder hacer que los diferentes intereses puedan llenarse, puedan satisfacerse. Gracias.
Thank you. So you are referring to the fact that the international community could contribute through a change in the development paradigm, and at the same time by continuing to promote dialogue among the different parties involved. Lucy,
Yes,
what about
indeed.
you?
Indeed, I agree with him on what he has said, especially in terms of making sure that cooperation and that there is that connection between all the parties. And I think Joanne brought it very clearly to make sure that that partnership really exists and we are able to cooperate and work together. Looking at the question that which has been asked and asking about strengthening protection of Indigenous people's rights, and yet we have financial cooperation. It's true, for a long time we've realized that the cooperation were kind of out. They were not very much included, and even Indigenous people did not work a lot with them. It was like a dialogue between the government and the corporations and the business communities and so on. And that's the reason why Indigenous people have intensified that collaboration of working together. We have the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity that has been working closely and very intensively together with the governments and also with the Secretariat, the UN agencies and so on, to make sure that the resources are well, benefit sharing is well done, and even being able to work together in making sure that the discussion on the benefit sharing and the cooperation, especially looking at our own genetic resources and so on, that the corporate do understand who we are and the traditional settings in our own communities. This is very important. And just like also the climate change, where they're working strongly together to make different corporations, different UN agencies to understand the system and to understand how Indigenous people work. So it's very important, and these paradigms can shift from one way to the other so long as we all work together and be able to understand and to bring the knowledge from corporate to Indigenous people, and also we take it to them and the UN agencies. At least there is quite a number of them who have worked and then go to the UN when they established the Decade of Indigenous People, because that was the time when everybody was really trying to understand each other. So there is hope, and also there is that window that if we all work together and put that partnership in place, we can be able to understand each other and minimize the gaps that are already existing, especially looking at issues of climate change and other Rio conventions, where we are working on desertification and we are saying enhance the land management and land use and make sure that Indigenous peoples are involved. For biodiversity, we are saying the post-2020 have to look at different issues and make sure that our rights are really respected and the free pre-informed consent is put in place so that we can all be able to work together and live in harmony with nature in the next 50 years to come. Thank you.
Well, very clear, very strong. If I had to synthesize what you have said is, again, dialogue and partnerships. Indigenous peoples joining forces, but also bridging with the corporate community, right? So establish a two-way communication with them as well, and not leave it that only to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Ivan Samrana, what's your response?
Y bueno, voy a hablar en castellano para ser un poco más preciso. En particular, yo creo que es importante entender que el consentimiento previo libre e informado es una condición necesaria, pero no suficiente para asegurar la responsabilidad corporativa, ¿no? Muchas veces estamos pensando que va a solucionar todos los problemas, pero también hay que entender la incidencia y la influencia que pueden tener las corporaciones en las estructuras internas de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces se necesita, como lo decía también el viceministro Ramírez, generar confianza entre los diferentes actores. Y eso incorpora también profundizar la confianza entre los estados y los pueblos indígenas, porque los estados tienen la obligación de responder primero a los pueblos indígenas que responder al capital. Es decir, sí es importante proteger los derechos económicos y la búsqueda de lucro de las corporaciones, pero nunca en desmedro de los derechos fundamentales de los pueblos indígenas, por ejemplo. Apparently the interpretation in English is not working, so I'm gonna again switch to English. So the issue is that, again, we have to ensure that corporate responsibility happens, not only because the instruments we already have, but also implementing different ways of generating trust between the different actors. And at the level of the international community, one of the things we have to overcome is this idea of just bringing the private sector into the discussion. There are many ways in which the private sector participates with the Secretary General, with the different member states, at the COPs. There are many different ways to incorporate the interests of the private sector, but the interests of all the different groups that Joan mentioned, women, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, are just emerging opportunities. We are not yet at the time in which we all have or are able to keep their view to the discussion. And that's something that has to happen. And at the same time, that participation has to translate into different and new mechanisms to ensure that their interests are not just considered, but they are prioritized. And that's especially important in terms of climate action, because as mentioned before, sometimes climate action, like a push towards renewable energy, could have very significant impacts on indigenous peoples. And at the same time, we have lagging the fulfillment of the right to access to energy of those very same groups. So that's something that we have to take into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. So here the key message has been trust, and trust between the state and indigenous peoples and all other actors concerned. But the fact indeed that states need to be responsive to indigenous peoples' requests, demands, aspirations, concerns, first and foremost. So I move to Joan. Joan?
Yeah, for me, what's needed is to make corporations and investors accountable, and to have mechanisms, effective mechanisms to make them accountable so that it will regulate their power in accordance to respecting rights. Because unless their power is not regulated to respect rights, particularly of indigenous peoples in respecting, our lands, territories, and resources, and providing access to justice, then the business as usual approach of corporations and investors will remain, because there's a direct conflict, and that's right. I mean, we want to conserve and sustain our resources for the future generation, and companies and investors want to make use of our resources for short-term gains and benefits, and that is a conflict. And unless we put equity and rights at the center of the use of our resources, then inequity will prevail if we don't make corporations accountable to their actions in relation to respecting human rights and also protecting the environment.
Thank you, Joan. Here, I mean, the word is accountability. And I think that indeed by bringing together all these different words, we are coming up with indeed some very insightful ways of moving forward. There is, we are approaching the end of today's session, but there is a question here from Sergio Torres, which I think it's interesting, which refers to the whole issue on free and prior and informed consent, to projects which are of a smaller scale. So it's not only thinking of large-scale development projects that may have major environmental impact or serious displacing effects. So I would therefore ask Ivan perhaps to respond to this question, because there is a specific reference to Bolivia. Very shortly, please.
Thank you. Can you please repeat the first part of the question?
Yeah, I mean, consultation with indigenous peoples should be applied also to projects such as the construction of roads, and there is a reference of a project, the TIPNIS project, where apparently such consultations with indigenous peoples did not take place.
Right. The thing is that one of the most comprehensive consultation process that happened in Latin America happened because of the project. And the problem was that at the beginning, when we were working with the legislation that was 20 years old, we needed a final design in order to start the process of consultation. And that is not enough to have the full input of indigenous people. So we had, because of the conflicts that emerged at the time, we had to create a different way of trying to do this consultation. And of course, both big infrastructure projects have to be, both big and small infrastructure projects and projects that are related to climate action as well, have to go through the specific legislations of each country. And that's something that has to happen, not because NGOs demand it or because it is something that is gonna generate, questions regarding the efficiency or the capacity of the government, but because through those consultations, you can reshape the way you do projects. At some extent, we forget that it's not only to ask permission of indigenous peoples, it's a matter of reshaping development goals according to the role that indigenous peoples can have as part of the whole society. And that's necessarily going to involve the weighting of collective rights at the local, at the regional, and at the national level. And that's something that we are still improving over time.
Thank you. Actually, you need some major failures in order to indeed rewrite policies with a view to making sure that lives of indigenous peoples might be better eventually. I have 1 minute before closing, and I would, and it has been an extremely rich conversation. So I'm not trying to attempt to do any sort of summary, because I would not be able to make any justice to what has been said. But I believe that, I mean, there are a number of sort of main messages that are coming up. The first thing is that indeed indigenous peoples are already contributing in very significant ways to countering climate change. That they are key partners and allies. I also believe that given the seriousness and the far-reaching implications of climate change, natural disasters, we need to have a change in paradigm, like you know, Oscar Perez Ramirez was highlighting. It cannot continue to be business as usual, which means indeed that the relationships between among all the key partners, which are the states, indigenous peoples at the national, global, national and local level, as well as corporate actors need to be redefined. The rules of the game need to be rewritten, and we already have some very clear, I would say, principles and guidance that can indeed assist in redefining those relationships in everybody's interest, in order to ensure that it is a win-win-win and not a zero-sum game. And of course, you know, the rights of indigenous peoples, as also laid out in Convention 189, 69, sorry, that all of you have alluded to, and other issues relating to, for instance, the need of also genuine good faith consultation, the development of true and genuine partnership, the whole issue of accountability, of dialogue, a dialogue that of course takes different forms according to different contexts, but that always need to be, again, driven by shared principles and clarity with regard to the procedures and what to do with the outcome of that. The very last important point, two last important points that were made is the need for shifting away from a project-based approach that seems to be still prevalent when we are, you know, talking about consultations of indigenous peoples, and really embracing a longer-term development and sustainable approach in which indigenous peoples are key actors and players. And the other issue is that indeed consultation is not just about asking for the permission of indigenous peoples to use the resources that are in their lands, but to indeed engage with them in redefining, in shaping together what to do in order to ensure that you know, the environment will be sustained, that the transition to a low carbon economy will be just, and that all of this will occur in a peaceful environment and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples. So thank you very much to all our lead discussants, to our participants for the questions that they have asked. A sort of virtual applause and keep up the good work. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.